Hi, I'm Alan Rusbridger, editor of Prospect Magazine, and you're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of Media Confidential with myself and Lionel Barber, in which we speak to a special guest. If you want to watch the full episode, please click on the link below, and if you want to subscribe to Prospect Magazine, please visit our website at www.prospectmagazine.co.uk. Enjoy.
So today we're delighted to be joined by Pilita Clark of the Financial Times. And full disclosure, I was a long-time colleague of Pilita, worked with her in various roles. But latterly, when you were the award-winning environmental correspondent, and you still write a lot about the environment, both as a commentator and reporter. And I wanted to ask you, Pilita, how you have gone about bringing alive and explaining this hugely complicated, both scientific, political story of climate change.
Well, thanks, Lionel. It's great to be here. Great to see you and Alan. I don't think that I approach or have ever approached climate and environmental issues all that differently to the way I covered aviation and aerospace before I was a full-time environment reporter, for example, or the way I tried to cover politics before that. I think fundamentally the tricks are basically the same. You know, you want to try to convey the story in as compelling a way as possible to readers. You don't want to bore them. You don't want to over-egg things. You want to be as fair and accurate as humanly possible. And you are basically just trying your best to do news, you know, to basically do journalism. And I'm not sure that there's very much difference in the way that I approach this topic to the way that I approach any others.
You don't have set things like question time at Westminster or the weekend football match. I mean, climate change is there, it's present. I mean, how do you pick your shots? I mean, are you looking for the anti-oil protesters to write one day, or are you looking at water shortages the next?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm always looking. I mean, I am particularly interested in, I guess, the politics and the business side of climate change because of where I am at the FT. So I've always actually thought that working on a financial newspaper was always going to be the most interesting way to cover climate change, really, because ultimately there was always going to be a clash and quite a lot of conflict between people who wanted the energy transition to go very quickly and people who wanted it to go very slowly or not at all. And if you were working for a business newspaper, you were going to have a front row seat to that conflict, which has really obviously been central to the whole climate story pretty much for as long as I've been covering it, certainly. And it's only intensified, I would say, in recent years. And probably after the events of this week will
Donald
become
Trump's
even
victory.
more intense. Yeah. So, I guess that's probably the way I'd answer that.
We should deal with that question perhaps near the top of the program, because you wrote a column just before Donald Trump got elected saying if he were to be elected, this would undoubtedly have an immense repercussions for the climate. What's the good? I mean, at its most alarming, you predicted that Trump could pull out of not only the 2015 agreement but the 1992 agreement. Do you still think this is a possibility?
Well, I mean, okay, so he has definitely said himself and his campaign team have said that he will move to take the US out of the Paris Agreement, as he did after he was elected the first time around. What's happened as well this time is that Project 2025, this Heritage Foundation blueprint, has also recommended that the incoming Republican president should also pull out of the parent treaty of the Paris Agreement, which is something that people wanted Trump to do in 2017. He didn't do it then. He now, though, has this resounding election result, control of the Senate and potentially the House as well. I think that the people who behind Project 2025 and elsewhere who are really keen for him to use these 4 years to embed serious permanent change to the largest extent possible when it comes to the energy transition and climate change will be pushing him to do this. Now, whether he does or doesn't, I don't know. But it's potentially going to be more dramatic, much more dramatic, really, than just pulling out of the Paris Agreement, because pulling out of that founding treaty means that when anybody from the US government turns up to one of these COPs, if they did, they'd have the same sort of badge as I would, or a Greenpeace person, or anyone else. You know, they don't take part in the discussions themselves, but at that level, then that's the world's big, the single big effort that exists to try to have a form of international climate collaboration. I think the outside the COPs, these big climate gatherings, the big problem is that if he does that, it emboldens other countries, important emitters, to just take their feet off the accelerator if they don't really feel like it, or just do more with or appear to be basically trying a bit, but not really trying as much. And then if anybody scolds them for it, they just say, well, you know, it's not as bad as the US. You know, in other words, so I think it has potentially a really quite chilling effect in some countries, or could have a chilling effect in some countries when it comes to just keeping countries under the sort of grand COP illusion that the whole world really wants to pursue or hasten the energy transition as much as possible. That really gets punctured when a group like, or a country as big as the US pulls out.
This is in many people's views, the biggest story in the world. And yet critics of what we have to call legacy media say that it's simply not cutting through, that legacy media doesn't know how to handle this story because it's so huge. In a sense, it's the same story day in, day out. When dramatic things happen, like the floods in Spain recently, people are nervous of making attributions. And so legacy media is not really doing justice to this, to the scale importance of this story. Do you agree with that?
Well, I do think that there is a tendency for some legacy media outlets to underestimate the level of concern and the hunger for climate information, which is really mirroring a kind of a more global sense that people have in general about climate change. There's a real tendency to underestimate the level of concern about it. There's been some extremely interesting research that's just only come out recently of, you know, more than 100,000 people in, I don't know, 60 odd countries, or maybe more than 100 countries, who, if you ask them questions like, you know, what would you be willing to give up 1% of your income to tackle climate change? I think it's something like 69% that they would be willing to do that themselves. But if you ask those same people, okay, well, so how many other people in your country do you think would be willing to do the same thing? Then that 69% goes down to 43%. In other words, people have no faith in the willingness of others to contribute. They also completely underestimate the extent to which other people are even worried about climate change. And the truth is, if you look at really quite respectable research groups like Pew, that have been monitoring global attitudes to climate change for a long time, you know, they were showing in 2014, globally, about 54% of people around the world said that they thought climate change was a major threat. By 2017, that had gone up to 62%. And then by 2022, it had gone up to 71%. So, you know, they've seen quite a ratcheting up of concern, which is no surprise because we are actually seeing the physical effects of climate change all around us now in ways that we didn't before. So I think it's no accident that when you see these media startups like Axios, Semaphore, to some extent Politico before them, they made quite a concerted effort to beef up the climate coverage, to make climate coverage a focus of their offering. And I think that sort of reflects an understanding there's a bit of a gap in the market when it comes to legacy media, which, by the way, have completely improved and increased not just the number of people covering climate and environment, but the seniority of the people doing it as well. So, I think you see that all the time, but I still think it's probably, we're possibly still missing a trick. I mean, even in your world, in the podcasting world, you must have, I guess, noticed just this huge number of climate podcasts that have erupted out everywhere. Now, they may not all be making a lot of money. I'm not sure what the listenership and what the audience figures are for them, but the fact that they exist, I think, does speak to this same level of this thirst and hunger for information, not necessarily boringly told. And of course, it always has to be told well and compellingly. But really, I think there is a real risk of underestimating the level of interest out there.
But journalists are in their comfort zone when they're talking about things that happened yesterday. They're very anxious about things that say, look, this could happen in 30 years' time. So, for instance, there was a report recently, I forget from which outlet, that said, that predicted really the breakdown of societies within 30 years if action wasn't taken. And it got virtually no coverage at all because you can see journalists saying, oh, well, 30 years' time, anything might happen in 30 years' time. Why don't we just deal with what happened yesterday? So you've got this trade which deals is most comfortable dealing with in established facts, unable really to process these predictions. How do you get round that?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and it's not just journalists who face this; it's everybody. It's climate scientists, it's government policymakers, it's everybody faces this same problem with this topic. It's why climate change has always been called a wicked problem. That we just find it difficult to deal with things that we don't necessarily know about, and long-term risks are particularly difficult. I think that what's changed, unfortunately, is that the risks that climate scientists were warning about not that long ago are already coming to pass. The danger of having something like the Spanish floods is something that climate scientists were warning about a long time ago. The risks of having these enormous hurricanes roaring through Florida in a matter of weeks, not separated by months anymore. The danger of having these massive fires. All of this stuff is starting to happen when we've got temperatures, long-term temperatures, reaching record levels, but it's still around, just below 1.5 degrees on an annual basis, actually, at the moment. The Paris Agreement it says that we don't want temperatures to rise above that, but we want to keep them well below 2 degrees. And I think when you start to see what's happening at the level of heat that we have today, then that is why I think the sort of climate denialism that was a real feature of my job when I first started writing about climate change, it's really just melted away. And in fact, the interesting thing I think now, you'll remember this, Lionel, we used to have loads of people writing into the paper anytime you wrote anything about a climate science story, to the point that we actually turned the comments off at one point, as did a lot of media organizations at the time. And it was mostly climate deniers, people from the right, essentially, who are often the same people, but not necessarily always. Now, there's tremendous pressure coming broadly from the left, from critics who think that the legacy media in particular is prioritizing objectivity over trust and essentially gaslighting readers and viewers by basically not making it clear enough that the world is screwed. There's tremendous opposition building in some quarters to legacy media organizations that still take ads from fossil fuel companies. I mean, this is a relatively new thing. It really wasn't happening that many years ago. And just in general, I think, you hear some really quite angry commentary now about, say, the New York Times' coverage in particular, where people get journalists who are mostly, I would say, part of they're not working in traditional media outlets themselves. They've started up their own very large number of climate news organizations, and they're very critical of the way that we cover the news. So it's just, it's really interesting to me to see how much that has shifted in a relatively short period of time.
Pilita, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about how you tackle your job in terms of sources. Give us some sense about how you get to form a picture of an issue, different opposing camps, how you get the science as right as you can.
Well, I guess it's partly a function of being as old as I am and having covered this for what feels like the 1800s, but it's not really. But anyway, I guess I have been able to spend a lot of time talking to, say, scientists. If you just look at climate scientists,
From around
I
the world.
from around the world, and I guess you get a pretty strong picture of the ones who have been consistently working on areas. Let's say something like tipping points, for example, is a good example of this, where there were scientists working on tipping points, or the idea that at some point these natural systems can reach a point of kind of no return, really, where change becomes very drastic and irreversible. And they were kind of seen as being they were kind of outsiders, even though they were working for very respectable research organizations, universities. And they were sort of steadily basically just publishing and saying that it would be a good idea for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to basically take their work into account. And eventually they did. And I think when you see this sort of thing happening, and then the idea of tipping points becoming more and more part of the mainstream, it kind of, I guess it confirms for me that it's really if you focus on the people who are doing the work and have been doing the work for many, many years, and are focusing on the same area, you just get a sense of who's trustworthy, who's not likely to be as trustworthy as others. I mean, I guess it's the same as any sort of area. The only thing I would say is that, the whole area, the whole field of climate science and research has just exploded in the same way that climate finance, climate investment, the whole area has just really, really grown to a point that the people that I used to talk to, quite a few of them, I guess, in many areas, not just science, but also in finance and other areas. Interestingly, I would say most of the ones I used to talk to are still doing the same sort of work. It's just that they're now surrounded by an enormous ecosystem of newcomers, some of whom are doing incredibly interesting things that weren't being done before.
Let me ask you about the green transition. As the environmental chief writer in this area, are you allowed or not allowed? Do you get deeply involved in the costing of the transition, or is that for the economic staff? I'm just interested how wide your writ goes, because there's a lot of controversy about whether the timetable is too tight, whether we can afford to make it, what the damage to the car industry, etc.
Well, I think this is a big shift that has happened relatively recently. Is as Richard Nixon didn't say, we are all climate reporters now. So the economics correspondents, the investment reporters, the aviation, the IT, the AI people, everybody is writing about climate change to some extent now, or at least much more than they used to. So, my very good colleague, Alan Beattie, our trade specialist, for example, writes a lot on climate-related issues now, green transition issues in particular. That really wasn't happening so much because the trade world itself wasn't as focused as it is now on climate and environmental issues. So, it's the same in any area. I'm just thinking of the people I sit next to around my desk, whether it's Chris Giles,
called a hub, isn't it? Yeah,
it's a major hub. It's a major hub. It's not a green hub, though. I have to say we do have one of those, but it's interesting because we have these dedicated climate reporters, and then we have various other hubs around the newsroom. But really, everybody is talking to everybody about this stuff. Even though the specialist climate and clean energy people, their numbers have risen. But then I would say that essentially everybody is writing about this to a large extent more than they used to. So to answer your original question, sometimes I do indeed look at the economic and financial aspects of this, but I have to really muscle my way in there past Martin Wolf and Martin Sandbu and Chris Giles and all these other people who are also writing about the same thing, which is great because it's terrific when you have someone with their backgrounds, I think, tackling these topics. That's the way it always should have been, and that's the way it is now, which is terrific.
Pilita, where are you on the debate about whether to scare or inspire readers? You'll be aware that there's a sort of a stream of psychology that says people can't, they just find it too scary to read about. And if you write about all the scary past stuff, they just won't read it. And so it's best to be writing about the hopeful technological things. And do you come down on one side of that argument or the other?
I do. I find this. I understand completely why this debate exists, but I just think that it's an interesting lens to apply to a journalism topic. Imagine if we said, well, we're not going to write too many more of these gloomy wars about what's happening in Beirut this week or what's happening in Ukraine, or, I just think it's
But this
not.
is existential.
Well, all the more reason then, I think, actually, not to apply that lens to it. I guess it goes back to my original point, really, which is that we should just treat climate in the way that we treat any topic. Try to make it really as readable and compelling and interesting. Make it fun. Don't ignore the solutions. But I think the danger of going down a solutionist path is that, quite frankly, you're not telling the whole story at all. Global greenhouse gas emissions last year rose to a record level at a faster pace than they were rising before the pandemic. That's where we are. Even though it's true that we've got fantastic levels of solar, wind deployment, we're making great progress on green steel, green cement. All of this is happening. It's great. It's terrific. It's just not nearly enough. And if we go about as journalists saying, or just trying to overemphasize the good news stories, I don't think we're doing our readers and viewers a service at all, and our listeners, sorry, a service at all. I don't. That's not really what a journalist's job is, in my view.
Every newsroom is obsessed with metrics now, I'm sure, including the FT newsroom. Are people reading climate change stories, or are they shying away from them?
I suspect that what's happening. The short answer is I don't. I don't compare every climate story to every other story as it appears on the day. Some of them do incredibly well. I know because I do make a close study of my own numbers, obviously, like every journalist does at the moment. And I do know that some of the most popular stories or the most read stories I've done have been about climate change. But it's when I've been doing things like, this year's biggest climate bullshitters or something like that, or, or something that is basically maybe having a bit of fun with the topic with a serious intent. It can. But, Ellen, I think, again, really, if we're going to focus on the numbers here, the danger is that we end up giving readers what they want. And, for example, they will generally want stories about culture wars, say, more than they'll want them about climate change. I'm not sure that that's necessarily something that we have to give into as news organisations. In fact, I'm pretty sure we don't. So I think there's a real risk if we just say, well, nobody's interested in climate change. Really, do we need to sort of bother with this? I think there's a real danger that, if you go down that path, you two know a lot more about this than I do. You've had a huge amount more experience with it, but it's not necessarily the right thing to do.
You're about to head off to Baku to cover the latest big conference. There's some alarm about the limited number of hotel rooms there, but what's it like covering these conferences? Because there's a sort of sense in which you have thousands of people in one place, and all you're waiting for is the final communique. How do you string out the time between arriving and the final communique?
Mm. So they are these very, very curious events, quite difficult to describe. A cross between this sort of mammoth green energy trade show, policy wonkery, off the leash. So it's like these big academic conferences. They're just panel after panel after panel. And at the same time, surrounding this, are these negotiations, which are sort of going on in the background almost now at these events because they've become such enormous talk fests and business.
Hot air.
Well, yeah, I mean, some of it is a bit of hot airish, to be honest, but it always was thus. But um, at heart, you're right that at the end you have these negotiations, and they come up with a communique. They come up with these decisions. It's not one single communique. It's very highly legalistic, and there's a ton of documents that spew out at the end. But the one that people look at most is the final decision text, as they call it. It's the sort of political document. And a whole lot of work is done in the background as well. So, yeah, there's always, if you are interested, if you're absolutely passionately, fabulously enthralled with things like carbon markets, or adaptation or food, health, all of these other things, they're all part of the negotiations as well. It's just that they don't get as much attention, really. So there's always going to be that sort of thing is going on. But I have to, it was really fascinating last year in Dubai at the last COP, where everybody was, so in fact, a lot of politicians didn't even want the COP president, who was head of the UAE's national oil company, to be COP president because it was such a conflict of interest and everyone thought it was going to be a big wash and terrible. It was fascinating because a Reuters journalist actually got hold of a letter that the OPEC head had written to all the OPEC countries telling them basically not to vote for anything or not to support anything that was going to really lead to any language in that final document suggesting that there should be a shift away from fossil fuels. And, that I think we hadn't seen anything happen like that before at these events. And it possibly did happen in part because the COP was held in a place like the UAE. So, people say these things don't matter and it's all hot air and it's all rubbish. And, why do news organizations spend so much money going to them? But, in the real world, they matter enough for the head of OPEC to write a letter like that. They understand completely what these events do, which is normalize the way we think about the energy transition and climate change.
Well, that's true, Pilita, but the last time I checked, Azerbaijan was quite a large oil and gas producer.
Yeah.
So it's the same pattern recurring.
Yeah, it's the second one in a row. That's right.
Yeah, what are we to deduce from that? Are you making any impact?
Actually, yes, I just wrote a piece on this, which is I guess it's going to be published shortly.
Oh, let's have a sneak peek.
So my view on this is that essentially, I mean, number one, you're just never going to change the rules of COPs to make sure that they're only hosted by countries that are taking the level of climate action that scientists say should be taken. But number two, I think it's actually fascinating to see what happens when you have a country. We've seen it with the UAE. Everybody thought this is going to be dreadful. Nothing of any import's going to happen. Well, for the first time, they did get, despite OPEC, they did get a final decision that said that the world should transition away from fossil fuels, that they'd never had fossil fuels used in a document like that in the past. But not only that, they managed to get a lot of the national oil companies, which are responsible for a huge share of oil production globally, to sign up to various decarbonisation efforts. Massive amounts of climate financing was agreed. They made, in other words, it exceeded expectations, I would say, dramatically when it came to actually what they achieved at the meeting. Now, whether Azerbaijan will do that will be, it's a big ask for them. They only actually got the news that they were going to host this thing in Dubai. So just about a year ago. Normally you have about 2 years notice. And Yeah, I mean, they didn't expect to get it. They put their hands up thinking that they would be vetoed by Armenia for obvious reasons. And then, lo and behold, because of various Byzantine reasons to do with Russia and Ukraine and Russia not wanting any EU member, they found themselves with the COP. So I don't think it's a bad thing. They've had to now spend a year explaining how deeply they care about climate change and what they're doing about renewables. And they want, above all, not to fail at this thing. They want the whole meeting to go well. And that's what happens every time you get this global attention focused on these countries. They do actually have to change in ways that they wouldn't have otherwise.
So, final question, Pilita. I'm going to put you on the spot.
Mm.
When do you think it will be the case that an aeroplane is actually hit by such severe turbulence that there is a crash which can be directly attributed to climate change? There's a lot of our listeners out there that are asking themselves that question. So, up to you.
I think that's a really, really good question. And
That's why they pay me the big bucks at Prospect.
I do remember, actually, Lionel, I think when you were editor and I was in my old job, I remember writing one of these highly speculative climate science stories by researchers who'd said, you know what, with climate change, we're going to have all of this turbulence, which is going to mean that airlines are going to have to send their planes in all sorts of different directions to avoid this stuff. Anyway, that has sort of apparently come to pass, and turbulence is more of a problem. However, the day that we see turbulence, you're talking about a downing of a large plane because of turbulence, and it's going to be directly attributable to climate change. Well, let's just hope that day never happens. It's not there yet. I think what's happening at the moment is that the airline industry, thankfully, is adapting as we speak to these pockets of turbulence, which are becoming, it seems, in some places, it seems as though there is more of a problem with turbulence. But so far, it's a story of adaptation. So let's just hope it stays that way.
There speaks Pilita Clark, award-winning environmental correspondent and former aviation correspondent. That's why you can answer the question. Thank you so much, Pilita.
Good luck in Baku, and I hope you get a hotel room.
Thanks so much. It's been great. Thanks so much for having me.